Now, throughout these years, we have learned a little more about what does it mean to shift, but perhaps less so about the geography of reason that is in need of such shifting, such turning. That geography, as the person who I am introducing has taught us, is by dimensionality, which is to say, we may live our lives, political, social, aesthetic, entrapped within a two-dimensional plane, from 16th century maps, which became the technology of choice for empires to go global, to Google Maps that in the 21st century tend to erase favelas in Rio de Janeiro and or not show protesters in the streets during the last 4 weeks in the Americas. All the way to the kinds of infographics that keep slicing and dicing individuals into individuals and parts thereof for the use of credit rating institutions. That kind of bidimensionality is the subject of criticism and analysis by Jorge Garcia. Jorge teaches at, as you can see, at El Centro de la Raza in the University of New Mexico. He was born in Mexico. But there are so many much more interesting things he does. He's a member of at least 2 Amerindian dance collectives. And I mean by that sun dancers. And he's also a timekeeper. And it is that device, that technology, which is both poetic and scientific, spiritual and objective, that he is going to talk about. Please join me in welcoming Jorge Garcia.
Thank you and good morning. Yes, my name is Jorge Garcia, and I was born and raised in Mexico. I grew up in the central part of the country. Then I moved to Chicago, and I now live in New Mexico. I'm a member of the, I'm a Gnostic dancer. I'm a member of a group called the Red Wolf Clan. I'm a sun dancer. And so a lot of the knowledge that I'm going to present comes mostly from those groups, and some comes from the analysis from the academia, I have to say. So a lot of this is community knowledge. And so I like to start this presentation by asking a simple question, and that is, how do we decolonize our thinking? I ask this because decolonizing ourselves or decolonizing something from the point of the academy sounds very trivial in many different ways, because the real question is, how do we actually do that? How do we come to the level of decolonizing ourselves, right? Frantz Fanon says that what matters is not to know the world, but to change it. And so I want to challenge you guys to think about these 2 things. Now, one is, how do we change the world according to Frantz Fanon? And the other one is, how do we decolonize our thinking? No? And let me also start by reading a very short poem. And I want you to please put attention to this. Does anybody know what this is? No? This is a flower, actually. Well, it's the representation of a flower. But keep in mind that this is what Venus, the planet, creates when he finishes all his cycles. It's a lotus flower. And so the poem says, it was darkness looking for the light of a new dawn. Military booths trampled the delicate stems and golden petals of that beautiful flower that has slept on the plain. Relentless, the human passions pronounced their sentence, and the wing a song was flying, it softly invoked an awakening which merciful times had kept gathered. Many years passed, and in the middle of the empty silence, the golden puppy awoke, opening the mysteries of yesterday. This poem is from Don Francisco Osuna. He's an Apache Indian, and he carries the Tolteca Chichimeca knowledge. And I love this poem because he goes straight to what I was invited, what I came to share with you guys. And that is this idea of 1492 and 2012. A few years back, 2 years ago, more or less, I wrote an article in the South as a State of Mind about 1492 and 2012 as our most current, present eras. And so there's a few things that I would like to do. One is obviously do the reference to these 2 years as the beginning of 2 eras, an overview of the Mesoamerican understanding of time and the interconnection between the sun, Venus, the earth, and humans, and to pursue a great understanding of how Mesoamericans placed the self in...
You mean 1492?
Yes, I'm sorry. Mistake. 1492, yeah. And to pursue again the understanding of how Mesoamericans place itself in the process of evolving with spiritual time. The reason I started out with how do we decolonize ourselves is because from 1992 to the present, a lot of things have changed. One of the things that changed is that we had to adopt most of the way the Western world thinks. And so a lot of knowledges were left out or marginalized. And so a frame of reference, in my point of view, is very limited. In terms of the Mesoamericans, one of the things that happened is that when they encountered Europeans thought a few things. One is that Mesoamericans had a lot of gods, right? And so they didn't really take the time to understand what was it that they were actually venerating or how they perceived or how they used the images that they had. They just said, well, these are gods, and that's it, right? And so let me present to you one that the Spaniards thought that this image was the devil, you know? And so a very complicated image, so many symbols, no? But there is one thing that I want you guys to put to close attention to, and it's the mouth. There's something coming out of the mouth. It's a flower. Okay? And then there's another symbol right here by the cheek. This symbol is called Nahui Olin, for movement. Okay? And so this whole image, all the different little symbols, you see weapons, an eagle, skull, jaguars, all of these represent part of the human condition, the way Mesoamericans were thinking about it. Okay? And so when the Spaniards asked the Aztec, they said, well, what is this? And they said, well, this is a representation of an almighty essence of the human condition, right? It's a dark essence. It's very powerful, and it'll make you trip. It'll make you fall. They said, well, if it's dark and it's powerful, it has to be the devil. So here's a representation of how how the Spaniards understood the concept of this. The name of this image is Tezcatlipoca, which is actually a representation of the subconscious, right? And so think about it. One mind, or what kind of people will represent the subconscious with an image of such as this, with the flower coming out of his mouth? Right? And so, I mean, it's a different way of thinking, right? But it's telling you a lot, right? It's telling you a lot because the fact that there is a symbol of balance and the fact that there is a flower, what this means is that if humans will actually understand their conditions as human beings, right, then they will be able to say beautiful things, right? That's what the speech, the way people spoke in Mexico was very profound, very respectful, right? And everything that you say will be balanced. And so that is the framework under which Mesoamericans actually were thinking about themselves, their communities, and everything that they did. No? And so it comes to the question, how do we understand time? No? And so the bottom line is that we measure time by using calendars, right? And so in our time we use the Gregorian calendar, right? And we also have indigenous calendars, so this is what we actually go by, no? And to me this is very problematic, and I get, I mean, not hugely, but it actually takes a lot of the understanding that we should have as human beings, right? And I'll explain why, no? And so the Gregorian calendar measures religious observances and the counts of sun cycles. But that's it. But think about it. It measures sun cycles, but it doesn't really mean that we move with the sun, right? In fact, we're always running away from the sun and from the natural elements. If it's too cold, we want to be home, right? We're not connected to them. We don't have to be connected to them. We lost that connection, right? Indigenous calendars, on the other hand, measure the passing of the earth, its respective energies, and with the relation with the sun, the moon, and Venus, right? And so whereas in the Gregorian calendar, this is actually how we see it, how we understand it, very second dimensional, right? It's just the passing of the sun. We have the spring, we have the winter, we prepare for that subconsciously, but it's very two-dimensional, right? This is how Mexicans actually look at their calendar. Look at this complexity. And I know that they say that Mesoamericans have 1,000 gods. No, they didn't have no gods. In fact, they didn't have a word for God. No, what they had was representation of cosmic energies, right? Cosmic energies that everybody experiences. That we're connected to them, that we understand them, that we live by them, it's a whole different question, right? But just like the way I show the essence of the subconscious, there's hundreds that represents every single part of our body. In fact, even think about the movement of the sun. I was explaining last night. When the sun moves to the south during this time, the Mexicans used to think of it as a huitzilopochtli, and huitzilopochtli means a hummingbird, okay? And so it means it's a hummingbird because even though it goes all the way to the south and it becomes smaller, it doesn't mean that it's less powerful, right? It just means that it has moved away. It's gonna reach the farthest point in the south. It'll take a few days, and then it'll start coming back again, no? And that's what the hummingbirds do. They fly back, they're very powerful, but one more thing they had in mind, right? They said when the sun goes down like that, because the sun actually represents life on earth, right? And so it represents the intent that human beings need to have, the intent that the power that comes from this part of the body, they have to have the intent to come back to the north, become big again and powerful like an eagle. Right? Like an eagle. Like an eagle. Why like an eagle? Because the eagle represents vision, right? And so Mesoamericans not only try to understand the essence of time, the energies of time, but they also allocated either archetypes or animals to represent and make sense of what they were actually trying to understand of themselves, right? So so the reason why they were calling the children of the sun is because they follow the sun and religiously, because for them it was the act of intent towards creating or achieving a vision. So, again, this is how we have it, right? When we are born, they make a piece of paper and they say you were born on this day, ta-da-da, and that's it. You got a name, yeah, go home. Here's the way they used to represent their birth certificate, so to speak. No? It starts with the Tlalpili, a 13 count of the years connected to Venus. It moves to the year, all the respective energies, the day, the 20-day cycle, the 30-day cycle, the Venus cycle, the moon cycle, the solar cycle, the Venus cycle, and right to the seconds. Every one of these represents time. All the way to the very seconds when a human being came out. No? Very elaborate. No? Very multidimensional in many different ways, because by the time you were born, you were already connected. Right? Take for example myself. I was born in a day Nawi Ocello, 4 Jaguar. Okay? So my essence, I do a lot of strategic planning. In fact, that's all I do. Because that's the kind of energy that I carry myself as a person who was born on a day Jaguar, right? So this person, for example, was born on a day Coat, Serpent, right? That means that person is pretty much someone who's going to collect a lot of wisdom, a lot of understanding, right? From the day and from the year, this is a symbol for knowledge. So this person is going to collect a lot of knowledge, and it's going to be very creative, right? And then you start, and so when the human being will be born, they'll do the reading, and they said, okay, based on this is how we're going to educate this child, right? So it can amplify all the energetic forces that the person already has, that is bringing with them. No? And so the result of the changes was this, right? That we went from three-dimensional energetic life to very simplistic in many different respects. No? A lot of what's taken out. So that's why I'm saying, when we said, let's decolonize, what do we mean by decolonizing? Decolonize to what? Right? Okay, so natural cosmology, the Mexicans were not the only ones who were thinking about that, no? Roger Ants in the book and the article, The Great Commentary on Chinese Natural Cosmology, says that as the question, what kind of participation in these natural processes can optimize the possibilities of a world in which natural and human events are two inseparable, mutually shaping aspects? And here's the key, right? So this whole thing about understanding time, understanding ourselves in a different way, is not just to know it. It's to make sense of it, and it's to actually act on them. And that's exactly what Mesoamericans did. And so here's a few more questions. What does it mean by natural process, and that the natural and human events are two inseparable, mutually shaping aspects? How do we understand that within the concept of time and space? What is the role that cosmology plays, and how do we know this? And most importantly, why should we care? No? Why should we care? So one of the things, for example, right now, there is this whole thing about climate change, right? And so there's a lot of, I was reading a few articles that they just came out and said, well, can we afford not to do anything? And the question is, what do we do? What do we do? Right? It's a very complicated question. And I'm not sure that there is a clear answer, but in my view, what we can do is actually start understanding who we are. Just to me, even if we just did that, who are we as human beings, then we're going to be doing something. So cyclical time. Dr. Jeremy Patrick, she's a Mayan scholar, says that the diagrams of the cosmos show that the cycles are conceived to come to completion where they began, to reassuring the emergence of an equivalent cycle at the next level. No? And so And so one of the reasons why I use 1492 and 2012, right, is because that's exactly what this is saying, right? We have to identify, and that's what Mesoamericans did, identify the very specific lapses of time and work with them. No? And so here's another thing that Mesoamericans did and still do. Mesoamericans believe in the future even if they don't know the present. No? And of course, that doesn't make any sense, right? How can you know the present but not, how can you know the future but not the present? And it doesn't make any sense when we just think about two-dimensional objects, right? But when we think in a three-dimensional objects, right? And then we can say, for example, okay, so here we are, 2012, well, already passed, but here's the new era. What is the new era coming up? And if we understand time, if we understand the essence of time, then we can act on that. And that's precisely what Mesoamericans did, right? They understood the future. They knew that in 2012, there was going to be cosmological events taking place, and they needed to ensure that the proper ceremonies were done in order to continue with that tradition, right? And so, because the importance that they put on things was not necessarily on what was going on right now, but how they were actually going to preserve the beliefs that they have and continuing honoring time. Okay, and so for them, Venus, no? They call Venus the messenger, no? And so one of the questions we have to ourselves is, why the messenger? Why is Venus the messenger? I mean, at the end of the day, think about it, no? Do we think about Venus? No, we never do, right? Unless there's a book that talks about the man came from Mars, I think, and woman from Venus. Apart from that, there's no thinking. But they call it the messenger, right? And so why the messenger? In the mythology, Venus represents Quetzalcoatl, no? Quetzalcoatl. I don't know if you guys ever seen Quetzalcoatl. No? They call it the feather serpent, no? Which, by the way, is not a feather serpent. It looks like it looks like if he has feathers and it's a serpent, but it's not the feather serpent. It actually represents, or is known as, the precious knowledge. Quetzal, which is a very beautiful bird, means precious. Coat, serpent, but is wisdom, right? And so, and Quetzalcoatl has a twin. It's the morning star, and it's the evening star, right? And so they follow this very beautiful and powerful. This is a very powerful concept, no? The Hanuk Ku, or else known also the Yin Yang, right? Very powerful. For one simple reason, this is the principle of life. The principle of life rests on the coming of opposite forces, creating something new, right? There's not myth. That's actually what happens. Each and every one of you here, and almost the things out there that are natural come because opposite forces come and they make it happen. No? The Nahuilim, the Hanukkah, the wind, and the essence of change, badly known as the Aztec calendar. If you look at the Aztec calendar in the bottom, there's two serpents coming together, facing each other. They call them the serpents of fires, because that is the principle of life. This is the principle of life. This is an absolute. So that brings me back to Venus, the times of Venus, right? So in 1518, May 26, 1518, Venus transit number 3 took place. 1526, Venus transit number 5 took place. And then in 2004, the same transit. 2012, the same transit. Transit 3 and transit 5. These are the times that people were thinking, how do we know this? How do we know that they were actually talking about that, that they were referring about that? No? I'll get into that now. Okay, so the historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto wrote the book 1492. I don't know if anybody has had a chance to read it. But this book actually is really important because it tells us exactly how people were feeling in Europe and in fact most of the world, right? And so in 1492, people were actually very anxious. They didn't know what was going to happen. They knew that people were going to another continent, but there was a lot of commotion, no? In Mesoamerica, the same thing happened, no? Mesoamericans were expecting the return of Quetzalcoatl. This is the symbol of Venus, and this is in one of the temples, no? So they were expecting the return of Quetzalcoatl. They were expecting the return of Venus, no? And in Europe, there was all this commotion, right? And so one of the interesting things is that, so around this time, the humanist, philosopher, and astronomer Marsilio Ficino promulgated the ideas of the Roman poet Publius Virgilius Maro, who made the case for a golden age, no? And so 1492, in fact, became the golden age for the West, right? If you think about all the gold and everything that they brought from our continent, became the golden age, right? Became a very, very powerful time. A quarter century later, in 1519, Cortés arrived to the peninsula of Yucatan, and that closed it all up, right? This largely envisioned golden age came into fruition. Europe became the conqueror, and for Mesoamericans, though, the arrival of the Europeans marked a time of darkness. But don't get me wrong, okay? In our present society, we have a lot of absolutes. We have a lot of things that we take for granted, or that we actually believe, no? Like this idea of good and bad, right? In Mesoamerican thinking, that doesn't really exist. So darkness doesn't mean bad, right? Darkness is actually meant a time of cosmic time of introspection, right? They knew it. So this is everything that it became, right? So we have industrialism, technology evolved, we became more interconnected. 2012, no, this is where we are today, but we're destroying the planet. That's just the bottom line, right? And we don't seem to actually have to see the end of it, no? The new pyramid became the almighty dollar, right? And everybody carrying it. That's the reality that we come to face today, right? That under our current system, we measure and understand the effects that happen on Earth by the needs of our capitalist and materialistic society. And I'm not necessarily saying that capitalism or materialism is bad. I mean, this is the life that we live in, and we all partake in that. And no,
It's bad, don't worry, bro.
huh?
It's bad.
Okay. So how do we understand our world beyond the needs of our capitalist and materialist society? No? Have you guys ever heard people say that the Mayans came from the stars, and you're like, whoa, how did they do it? No? Well, it's a very simple thing, bro. No? We all come from the stars. All of us come from the stars. Because think about it. If you were going to live in another planet or in another galaxy, and you were able to see up to the Earth, what would you see? A blue dot, right? And so, in many different ways, no, this idea of the Gregorian calendar and how we took ourselves from the equation is that we actually stopped seeing ourselves as part of everything else. No, the Lakota people from the north have a saying. It's called. They say, "Mitakuye." Oyasi. It means all my relations. No? The Mexicans say Ipanemuani, that from which we live. No? And so they saw themselves as connected to everything that there is. That's the reason why in that image that I showed with the animals, right? The connection was with everything that they had, and not only in the earth, but in the universe, because we are cosmic beings. And so they really try to live in harmony with the spirit of their times by understanding the energies that comprise the conjunction of time and space. If you ever go to Mexico or actually anywhere else in that continent, our continent, one of the things that you're gonna see is that people have ceremonies almost every day, census and all kinds of ceremony, because people were very ceremonial. They were really, really thinking about how do we balance ourselves, and it was only through ceremony, through dance, songs, poetry, no, that they were able to achieve that. No, and so how to know this? So Mesoamericans came from a long line of stargazers and timekeepers. In fact, I challenge all of you guys. Take a look at take a look at the Aztec calendar, and even though it has so many images like I show, all of that is actually mathematics. The biggest conflict to learn the calendar is mathematics. It's extremely mathematical, right? In fact, it goes all the way to even the dances, the song, everything that we do has to do with precision. It's mathematical, right? And so they were not just looking at the sky. They were actually big thinkers, no? And so they knew that the arrival of the Europeans meant what it meant in terms of the painful and disastrous encounter, but rather in terms of the effects and the way of life that they had been cultivating for thousands of years, right? And so once the conquest culminated, Mesoamericans retrieved to faithfully wait for the time to come again to regain their cosmic journey to cultivate their harmony, the harmony that they saw in the stars, no? And so in 1521, right before August 12th, of 1521, the last recognized leader of the Aztecs, his name was Cuauhtemoc. He went to the people. He was commanded by the councils to go and talk to the people and to tell them, because you have to think about this particular time, right? So the Mexica people, along with other allies, they controlled the entire valley of Anahuac, right? Mexico. And so they knew that on August 13, 1521, their whole life was going to change entirely, right? And so he told them, he went and he told them, our sacred energy has already been well hidden. Our venerable sun dignifiedly disappeared his face, and in total darkness they left us, right? It really passed through my mind for a lot of years. How can these really brilliant people who understood the stars can say something that makes no sense, right? How can they say that the sun, because and it's a whole speech that he gave, he says that the sun went down, he says, but we know that the sun is going to come up, and when it does, everything is going to come back again, and we're going to continue on our journey. And for the time being, destroy everything you have, and safeguard what is more sacred to our people. That was the last speech that he gave in August 12th, right? And so of course, the story that we hear is that Mesoamericans of the Aztecs were thinking that Quetzalcoatl was going to come, and that somehow Cortés became the Quetzalcoatl and all these fairy tales. No, not true. Not true. And so in the next part, here's what it says. So we certainly know that again the sun will deign to return, that again he will have a well to come out, and again come worthy to enlighten us about our journey on this earth, right? And so that's the year 2012 represented the beginning of time for all knowledge to emerge and to flourish, so that people from the American continent can continue their destiny as the children of the sun. And so people acted on their faith, right? And so one of the things that happened in Mexico is that everything was safeguarded, everything was, all the knowledge and everything that people had, people kept it in their communities. No, if you think, for example, today, right, in the United States alone, there is thousands and thousands of dancers. Why? Because as early as 1880, people started to organize, because they knew that the time was going to come. And so 1880, 1920s, 1960s, people began to reorganize by teaching people the knowledge that I'm now presenting to you, because they knew that it was time, and then they had to be ready, no? And so maintaining order. And so this is what I was telling you, right? This is our little neighborhood that we belong to. We're not separated from that. We're not. It's just that we don't really see ourselves in that dimension. No? And so why does this matter? If we look at the event of the year 2012, just in terms of the inevitable encounter, we might neglect of using the profound teachings of those who understood the events that led to the outcomes on the encounter as part of the spirit of their times. And so I think this is a big lesson, no? If we don't really think, if we don't think outside the box for ourselves, no, and we think of the encounter and the present time as a doomsday, and there's nothing we can do, but then there's nothing we can do, right? But in our case, there's a lot of things that we can actually do, and people have been organizing for decades now, no, and in many different interesting ways, no. For example, they said that when the Spaniards came, one of the most sacred ceremonies that they had in Mexico was a ceremony called the Sundance, right? And so it's still practiced in Mexico, right? But it's not recognized as a Sundance because the Sundance actually moved to the north. And so what they said is that when the Spaniards came, then they actually took that ceremony in order to protect it, right? And then in the 1970s, when the Lakotas were actually fighting against the U.S. government, the Chicano people and the Mexicano people went to fight with them, and based on that, they recognized each other as brothers and said, you know what, we're going to give it back. And so now you have Sundances back in Mexico all over the place again, right? So the cosmic dance, right? And so this view of time like a cosmic dance allow people to understand the changes that happen on the earth, and that is why, as opposed to the European experience, the Mesoamericans had a faith not based on abstract concept, but based on concrete cosmic events that had a real effect on the earth. There were people who highly depended on the earth climate to survive through the hunting or growing seasons, and their main collective mission was to ensure that the count of time was done properly to align the socio-human, earth, and cosmic phenomena. Right? And so why do we call it the cosmic dance, right? One of the things that you saw in the calendar that I presented, no? The interesting part of that is that every one of those, or most of those, if not all of those images actually have dances, represent dances, right? So it's the cosmic dance because it's not something that we understand through our conscious and our intellect, but it's something that you actually dance. And so when we dance, we have dances for the 20-day cycles, for the 13-day cycles. Every single one of those dances actually represent days in the calendar. So when we're dancing, we're actually dancing the time and understanding how the time. So if, for example, I was born in a jaguar time, you know, or if I was born in an eagle time, no, and we have dances for jaguars, we have dances for eagles, and then you were actually able to understand what they meant in terms of the energy that you have to profess, that you have to carry on in order to understand the spirit of that specific animal. No, that's what we call it, a cosmic dance. No, and so based on that, to maintain the sacred connection with time and space, people maintain the timekeeping through ceremonial dances and what is known as the guerreros of the Santa Cuenta. So the dancer actually became the warriors of the sacred count because it was the dancers who were mostly in charge of making sure that the ceremonies and the attendances of everything that is related to the ceremonies actually took place. No? And believe me, carrying any of the ceremonies that have to be done, for as many dances that they have to take place during the year, is a big, huge responsibility. In terms of time, in terms of money, organizing, and so the dancers, no, we're in charge of maintaining this little thing over here. This is what we call the sacred form, la forma sagrada, right? Because this floral arrangement, this thing that we create, no, has 260 flowers, no, and it represents the symbol of balance, no. So we do this several times during the year, but at least 4 times for the most important ceremonies, no. And so this is what the dancers. That's why in Mexico, if you ever go, there's all kinds of dancers. You have Aztec dancers, all kinds of dancers. No, everybody's doing exactly the same thing. No, maintaining their form. So the passage of Venice in 2012 marked a time of cosmic change known as the New Dawn of Indigenous people. This is how Indigenous people actually, and I'm going to present a list of all the things that people have done to get to the New Dawn of Indigenous people. In Western society, the conventional belief was that the year 2012 will mark the end of the world, right? Because that's one thing that we know, right? That in 2012, the world was going to end, right? And nothing happened. And so for them, I make a joke, right? So 2012 became the day or the year that nothing actually happened, right? But it didn't happen because Hollywood was selling us a story. No, I was on the plane one time, and this American guy told me, "Well, I hope that that the Mayans are correct in what they're saying." I'm thinking the Mayans, but the Mayans never said anything. They never said that the end was going to. How can they say that if they knew it's a cyclical time? A cycle was going to end. That's what they were thinking. But of course, it became part of this. Part of this idea, mostly promulgated by the church, that the world is going to at some point. No? When I was a kid, and my father told me one time, they've been talking about the end of the world since I was a kid. And they're still doing the same thing, right? That keeps us at our age. And so, no, for Indigenous people, it just marked a time in which science and knowledge will resort again to provide guidance and understanding, right? And so here are the things that people have done. And this is not a complete list, as I said, because it goes back to records that I have from 1880, when people actually started organizing. But 1990, okay? This is at a continental level. People got together in Quito, Ecuador, no? And they promulgated the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, no? Now, this is very interesting, right? Because we have to ask ourselves, why Quito, right? Quito is actually, and I might be a little mistaken, so if there's anybody from Ecuador, please forgive me, but for what I understand is that Quito represents, the word Quito represents, it's related to the sun, to the, but I don't know exactly, but anyways, in Quito, everybody met, and this prophecy was promulgated, and that brought everybody together on this prophecy of the eagle and the condor. They organized multiple times during that decade, no, but in 2000 they met in Teotihuacan, no, to kind of close the decade, no. In 1992, actually, they did in between. They organized to protest the 500 years of the arrival of Christopher Columbus, no. In 2004, when Venus crossed the sun, actually everybody got together in Guatemala to reignite the continental fire, no, and start working. During this time, many tribes across the continent began to re-establish their sacred fires. No? The Haudenosaunee and the Mohawks had a condolence ceremony in June 2012, no? And that was to bring back the peacemaker, the idea of the peacemaker. Now, who's the peacemaker? The peacemaker is Quetzalcoatl, but the peacemaker is also Jesus, right? So there is this, across culture, this understanding of the peacemaker, someone who actually comes and brings, right? And so the Haudenosaunee people and the Mohawks, they actually held this, and it was in the headwaters of the Mississippi River, no? And this is very interesting that it was done in Chile in the Mississippi River, no? Because think about it, no? So in the mythical times, Quetzalcoatl came, right? And he instructed people on how to live peacefully, right? According to the books. He came from the west, from the east, sorry. Came from the east. Now, right across, so right in the east, there is the Gulf of Mexico, right? And so what you have is that the Mississippi actually falls right in the Gulf of Mexico. All along the Mississippi River, there's a lot of pyramids, although the United States will not recognize it, they don't do anything about it, but there's a lot of pyramids that actually have the form of a serpent, no? And so, and all those tribal people from the United States have this idea of the peacemaker, no? And so they brought it all together, no? June 2012, everybody got together close to the headwaters are close to Canada, and then everybody went to their places to hold their own ceremonies at the end of the year, no? Here's another interesting fact about our continent. So, in 1990, when these people got together, in 1992, they started something that they called the Continental Runs, the Peace and Dignity Runs, no? So check this out. Since 1992 to the present, indigenous communities from the entire continent have been running across the continent. Every 4 years, religiously, people have actually been running across the entire continent. They get organized, they bring to a certain place all the different ceremonial stuff that they have, they send it to their respective places, and then people run all across the continent. They get together and they reaffirm their commitment, no? So what is the future of the of the future, no? So Earth Timekeep is just as a side note. It's a group of people. I'm one of them, but there is the Hopis, the Otomis, and many other tribal people are engaged in actually teaching and getting ourselves reorganized around time, no? And so the mission is to bring back the understanding of the ancestral calendars, creation stories, and indigenous principles associated to time. This action will enable the development of a new form of leadership that embodies the principles and values of the new dawn as it relates to indigenous understanding of time. By doing this, we are ensuring that we can continue the task of creating harmony through our dances, our songs, and our way of life here on the earth. And so I ask again, how do we decolonize our minds, no? And I say to do that, we need to go back to where we came from, right? And so where do we came from, right? We come from here, right? We come from the heart, right? And then beyond that, we come from whatever place so was born, the people that we know, and we make relations again. The problem that we have, if you think about it, and this happened a lot in the United States, no? We have no connection to place. We become mobile people. We go here, we go there, no? 18 years old, I don't want to know anything about what I have, I want to go somewhere else. We have no connection to place, a sense of place, a sense of what we called in Spanish querencia, no? A love for a place, no? And so, that's my talk. Thank you.
Let me invite Lara and Stephen and Jorge to join us for a first panel in which we would listen to Lara and Stephen while we also engage in conversation with Jorge. Leticia is going to be kind enough to help us facilitating the panel. So let me just welcome those of you who are joining us this morning once more. You need another 2 chairs? And the room is yours, Leticia.
Do we have
Sure.
a microphone?
We have 2.
Okay, thank you. You want to sit? So I would just say some brief words because I think it's important to try to make this a conversation instead of an academic presentation. No, but you can present, don't worry. Yeah. But actually, because I was listening to Jorge, and yesterday I was telling him that I'm doing a training in psychology and that I'm working at the NHS, and he looked at me and said, well, I think the best psychologists are indigenous people, and I think he's right. He's completely right. And I woke up this morning thinking how we are not listening carefully to this kind of knowledge. And at the same time that he comes here, I wonder if the Western culture, if the Western souls are really listening to him, or is just seeing him as an object, or is really incorporating all this knowledge. Because as he said, I think we can only make change possible when we are in movements ourselves. So it's not an easy task because it's not something out there to be achieved, but it's this constant movement and the capacity of changing paths constantly. It has nothing to do with bad or good, in a way. And talking about this kind of knowledge, I was reading recently the book The Teachings of Don Juan, A Yaqui Way of Knowledge by Carlos Castaneda, where Don Juan says, seek and see all the marvels around you. You will get tired of looking at yourself alone, and that fatigue will make you deaf and blind to everything else. And as I'm in the spot now chairing this session, and as a Brazilian, I cannot ignore the fact that, and talking about deafness and blindness, the fact that the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, he was opening the United Nations General Assembly, and he insisted that the Amazon is not being consumed by fire, a lie that was translated into all languages, and we all saw the Amazon on fire, right? We all saw this, and he was saying that was on fire. So, and also the United Nations, and now I will introduce this panel, which is an institution, a democratic institution, doesn't know how to deal with these lunatic, perverse, authoritarian leaders. So there is a failure, an institutional failure, and I think this panel is about creativity and inventiveness in relation to institutions. And what Fanon has to do with all that, I think when I was reading the last chapter of the Wretched of the Earth, and I was struck by the similarities of what is happening to the Amazon and other communities, and all the mental and the pathologies that Fanon describes, because we are all getting sick in a way. We are all having mental disorders. So at some point, what's going to happen when the destruction finally happens in a way? We'll be all in mental hospitals, like Fanon described in his last chapter of The Wretched of the Earth. But this panel is about hope, is about creativity, which I believe that despite all the catastrophe that is taking place, is something that always survive. And I think this, in academia or political practice, we are in the habit of deploring the crimes of colonization and capitalism. And the word of decolonization became the order word. And my question maybe to this panel is, despite our claim for decolonization, did we have changed all that much? Did we learn how to listen? From theory to practice, do we look to the future, or we keep looking back, repeating the same old ideas, although saying otherwise? Are we creating new terrains of thought and possibilities? How can we experiment and think creatively within this catastrophic scenario? Hope and justice is something to be achieved or something to be constructed? So these are some questions that I would be interesting to explore in this panel, and I'm pleased to introduce Lara Sheehi, who is a clinical psychologist, a scholar, activist, and professor of clinical psychology at George Washington University.
He's going to start.
Okay. Yeah. So Stephen Sheehi, who is the chair of Middle East Studies at William and Mary College in Washington and Faculty Director of the Colonizing Humanities Project.
Thank you. So thank you for chairing, and thank you for opening up with those great questions. Mine is a semi sort of academic-y sort of thing. I'm going to try to just read really fast, so forgive me. But I would like to thank you for chairing, Jorge for this incredibly thoughtful talk, Oscar and Birkbeck for doing all the hard work, Nelson, Mireille, the Fanon Foundation, Kojo, and the Funk Collective for all making this happen. And I just wanted to connect maybe that there's going to be a bit of a chasm, seeming chasm between our talks and what we heard, but I think what contains the three is thinking about selfhood and inner selfhood in relation to the hegemony of settler colonialism. So how selves remain throughout time, despite the violence of the hegemony of coloniality. The settler town is a strongly built town, all made of stone and steel. It is a brightly lit town. The streets are paved with asphalt. The streets of his town are clean and even, with no holes or stones. The settler town is a well-fed town, an easygoing town. Its belly is always full of good things. The settler town is a town of white people. The town belonging to the colonial people, the colonized people, or at least the native town, the Negro village, the Medina, the reservation, are all inhabited by evil men. It is a town without spaciousness. The native town is a hungry town, starved of bread, meat, of shoes, of coal, of light. The native town is a crouching village. A town of niggers and dirty Arabs. The native town. The native town looks to the settler's town with a look of lust, a look of envy. It expresses his dreams, to sit at the settler's table, to sleep in the settler's bed, and if possible, with his wife. While I read these words in Palestine, there was utter silence. I read Fanon's famous passage from the Wretched of the Earth in Nazareth, Nasira, the largest majority Palestinian town in 48, the borders of what is now known as the State of Israel. To a group of training clinicians, psychology, to their 2 Palestinian supervisors and 1 Jewish Israeli supervisor. Only 2 of the 18 trainees, the 2 older women, who were around the 40s, had heard of Fanon or read him. The silence in the room held 70 years of colonial pain and oppression. The silence was thick with affect that still had not been spoken. Well aware of their second-class status in the Jewish state, what was Fanon articulating that these Palestinians themselves had not metabolized? Fanon gave coherence to an ever-present wound and wounding. Palestinian inside so-called State of Israel remain abject colonial subjects of a colonial settler regime guised as a democratic state. They were, despite the trappings of their citizenship and according to Lana Tatur's recent article, the domination of their citizenship, were still the wretched of the Ard, inhabiting a world as a people, individuals, and clinicians, divided by the brightly lit, civilized Israel and the lustful colonial subjects. Therefore, when I read, the colonial world is divided into compartments of native quarters and European quarters, of schools for natives and schools for Europeans, and in the same breath, Fanon recalls apartheid and, of course, Palestine now, we would think. This divided world replicates itself into psychic structures, the spaciousness of the colonial qua universal psyche, the healthy psyche, and the constrictions of the colonial psyche. Our experience in speaking with clinicians throughout Palestine over the past 2 years revealed a textured and at times conflicted consciousness of Palestinians under Zionist occupation, both inside the state now known as Israel and under occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We were not allowed access to Gaza. This multifaceted consciousness consciously and unconsciously struggles with the Manichaean psyche, the healthy universal, and the constricted colonial psyche. Within this tension, the psychic binary, Palestinian self-awareness of these clinicians, the Palestinian self-awareness of these subjective self-awareness of these clinicians is still marked by a keen sense of the psychological mechanisms and effects of Israeli settler colonialism on the multi-layered, historically constituted, fluid Palestinian selfhood. But on the other hand, colonial anxieties arise from the quotidian practices of living different forms and levels of intensity of settler colonialism. These colonial anxieties may express themselves among clinicians as a fantasy of repairing the rupture between Palestinians and Israeli Jews. This fantasy ameliorates the bad faith within the exclusionary ethno-nationalist regime disguised as a democratic state that demands a Kleinian splitting. The anxieties arise from a desire to maintain the educational, social, and professional benefits and privileges of being second-class citizens, who share meaningful relationships with good and liberal Israelis while living in an illiberal state governed by bad racist legislators and politicians. Discussing Fanon within the clinical training setting in Nasira did not reveal a new realization that the Palestinians were second-class citizens. All Palestinians are quite aware of their precarious status under Israeli legal and social order. Rather, what came to light in discussing Fanon to clinical trainees was a particular form of displacement. That is, these trainees understood the inequalities within the Israeli polity between Jews and Palestinians. They clearly understood their position as non-Jews in a Zionist state. Yet, their own alienation, as Fanon would identify it, was contained within a social, political, and psychological system that allowed them to mitigate and attend to the suffering of their own communities without having to fully endure the range of explicit colonial violence experienced by their compatriots in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and in Gaza. Their colonial alienation emerges frequently in how many trainees relayed not their experiences, but the experiences of their parents and grandparents. That is, a number of clinicians and trainees related what seemed to be an archetypal story. The sort of story repeated itself over and over again. After 1967 or 1948, their grandfathers or fathers refused to interact with Jewish Israelis. These patriarchs, at times broken men and at times social leaders and cultural paragons, refused to learn Hebrew, refused to cooperate with the state, or refused to cooperate with their puppet Arab councils. At the same time, they refused to leave their own villages or regions, or the regions that they lived in, even for short periods of time, missing weddings, funerals, social events, economic opportunities. And we should be reminded that after 48, between 48 and 67, there was a series of administrative laws that contained Palestinians within their areas. They couldn't travel outside their villages because they were claimed as military zones. So it was only up until after 66 that Palestinians throughout what is now known as the State of Israel were able to travel freely between their villages. They weren't allowed to leave villages without permissions, and they had specially marked ID cards. So much of the system that exists under occupation in West Bank actually was pioneered in the first 20 years of Israel's life as a political entity. Yet the discussion of Fanon, particularly of how Fanon offers psychoanalysis of structures of colonialism, reproduce a constituent repressed affect of colonial reality. It connected these clinicians to their own lived colonial experience that was otherwise displaced onto their grandparents and fathers. Fanon made affective the coloniality of the quotidian life, of which they already knew cognitively. Many Palestinian clinicians spoke of their patients in ways that replicated the coloniality of psychoanalytic epistemology. They noted the difficulty in having their patients think abstractly. They deployed notions such as primitive functioning, Oedipal conflicts, castration complexes. And they often suggest as communal and collective subjects that Palestinian social space precluded or obstructed Arabs from a rich, nuanced, differentiated, individualized internal world. These are all sort of psychoanalytic or psychological sort of monikers for good mental health. Such beliefs are not mobilized intentionally in the service of the colonial order. To the contrary, they are deployed at times to explain the inability of the condition of Arab Palestinian psyche that makes them vulnerable to or resilient despite Israeli structural violence. Liberal Jewish Israelis, along with class Palestinians, exercise what Lara and Leilani Crane have called ideological misattunement that accompanies a crude cultural sensitive approach to therapy. Cultural sensitivity is confused with cultural determinism, working from an assumption that the Arab mind operates on a fundamentally different schema from the liberal individuated sensibilities of the modern self. Against the backdrop of Fanon's description of the native versus colonial town, the coloniality of the psychic spatial structures emerge forth from an epistemology that structures the colonized subject around an unresolvable contradiction. That is, the Palestinian is diagnosed, as Fanon says, by his culture, his religion, his race, his family as a monolithic unit. Or, contrarily, we are told that Palestinians have a rich individuated psyche, just like us, that psychologists need to help nurture into true individuation. And of course, individuation means that you exist fundamentally separate from your society, from Palestinian society. The Palestinians, too, show us how to weaponize in the service of the colonized the tools and insights of psychoanalysis without reinscribing the normativity and mastery of such an ego ideal of the colonial master. While I offer no answers, I want to loop back to the affect in the room in reading and discussing Fanon in Nasira. Those clinicians understand that their town was the reservation, the Medina, the Medina and reservation filled with dirty Arabs, which that's what they're called inside the state now known as Israel. But the affect in the room articulated that Fanon was speaking to the psyche of the ideal ego, the intact ego of the Palestinian self, this sort of self that has been around, that predates 1492, right? The affect in the room was a materialization of the indigenous self-awareness of these clinicians. The anecdotes of their fathers and their grandfathers gave legibility to this awareness that validates Palestinian ontology and psychology. Ontology and psychology themselves functioning as weaponized defenses and therefore offenses against settler colonialism and in the service of the liberation of the Palestinian town and village. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very touching presentation. And actually, I was thinking also about my training in psychoanalysis in this country where we are working for the NHS. We are not reading Fanon. We are not reading Fanon at all. So we are dealing with loads of people, migrants and psychiatrists are not reading Fanon. And came to my mind once when I was working in a hospital, and this woman from Jamaica, she was saying that Christ is black. And the white psychiatrist said, she's delusional. And I said, well, delusional is to think that Christ is white. So I think Lara will be able to talk more about clinical work, as she has a lot of experience in this field. So I'm very happy that we'll be able to listen to you and learn from you.
Thank you. So I'm going to springboard off. And as a clinician, hearing the way that clinical psychology talks about indigenous folks and brown and black folks enrages me every single day. And that's the rage that I'm fueled by. That's the rage with which I teach. And that's the rage with which I'll be speaking today. So the overarching theme is decentering Eurocentric practices of clinical psychology. Ash yesterday, before she started to speak, asked me, how does it look differently when we practice from a decolonial praxis, right? And I didn't get to answer it, but I'm hoping I'll answer that today somewhat. I'll outline 4 overarching recommendations that I've been working on that may move us toward a decolonizing praxis of clinical psychology, or psychology in general, working to decenter Eurocentric practices in clinical work with the aim of an attuned care that advocates for liberated and dignified existence, especially of the colonized. I invite us to think about these recommendations as nonlinear and multi-layered, like you were saying, and most importantly, to invite a humility and openness to learn and adjust practices, theory, and treatment based on input and guidance from the communities we serve. Psychoanalysis, particularly in psychology in general, are not good at this. They are not good at being fluid. They are not good at, even though they espouse these ideals, it's a very difficult adjustment to make, and I think, Jorge, you really outlined why that might be the case. Let me give a caveat. These might seem like common sense measures when I say them, but the crush of ideology in the clinical world is real, and the one-on-one encounter is very seductive in limiting the scope and parameters of our thinking and our action. So it still is very much thought of as an individual encounter, even though we deal with group processes. That is very rarely sort of talked about in clinical circles, and very much the individual encounter still, it reigns supreme. And it quickly becomes a stand-in for everything else. So even when we're talking about group process, it oftentimes is reduced to the individual encounter, and we lose the systemic and the structural within that. So the 4 points, I'll start with number 1, is number 1, relinquish the concept of disorder, especially trauma as a disorder. The movement away from an individual disorder, held and felt primarily on the individual realm, is key. While at first glance this may read as provocative, various models exist, especially from indigenous folks and indigenous clinicians, including models that reject a medical-based understanding of diagnoses, especially regarding trauma, and instead locating it in non-pathological terms within a normative response to sustained historical oppression. For example, Braveheart in 2000 expands on her previous work defining and documenting historical trauma. Gone, all of these are indigenous folks. They make the center of all of this, and probably not by accident. Describes historical trauma as complex, to differ from Herman, who is looked at by and large as the person who's the leading person in, by the way, in 1997 of trauma theory in psychology. So the arrogance of Eurocentric practices to say that in 1997, this is our point of starting about trauma. Her definition of complex trauma, this differs. So Gaughan's definition differs from that. And collective and this is a quote from him, as incorporating both the psychological and social sequelae of historical oppression, whereas PTSD as a form of psychopathology that is officially classified as a mental disorder so that it can be treated by mental health professionals is largely confined to the psychology of the individual. A move to understand trauma, for example, as sociopolitically based versus individually felt or experienced is important because it decenters the emphasis on pathology and instead acknowledges and normalizes social and psychological responses to structurally embedded violence and violations, which are ongoing. Understanding diagnoses, and especially the very popular PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which many argue there is no such thing as post when you're talking about ongoing violence, primarily through a medical model, also creates the potential of missing relevant contextual information, that's also what you were talking about in the multi-layered, in a bid to adhere to criterion purity, right? So the DSM has very specific criteria, and when people are wed to that, they miss the contextual pieces. That is, the understanding the diagnosis is fitting within the strict frame of descriptive criteria. This is to what, for example, Palestinian clinicians object. Yaad Ghanadri Hakim and Dr. Samah Jabir, head of mental health services in Palestinian territories, warns of when she refers to PTSD as a Western construct, highlighting that for the Palestinian community, quote, there is no post because the trauma is repetitive and ongoing and continuous. Moving beyond the disorder to incorporating existing and historically organizing concepts has the effect of recentering the person above the disorder or symptom profile. This decentering of the medical and individual and recentering of a communal, historical, and political understanding of psychological struggles contributes to what Duran et al., again, indigenous clinicians, refer to as, quote, a relationship with a disorder instead of being the disorder. Again, going back to the cosmic relationality of everything. This relational possibility, in turn, creates liberatory and decolonial potential by way of centering long-held narratives and creating new narratives. So that's number one. Number two, validate sociopolitical reality and history. Again, seems so common sense, but clinical psychology does not do this. They always talk about psychic reality of the person and really does not validate sociopolitical reality and history. Validating reality and history may include acknowledging the limitations of mainstream treatment methods, especially under the crush of current global violence. Indeed, it would be arrogant to assume that our theories and practices adequately address the material conditions of the politically constructed, for example, human rights crisis in the United States, detention centers, or Brexit. Validation also implies moving beyond the symbolic into the real and ridding ourselves of archaic notions of treatment-resistant individuals. We hear this a lot about Black and brown folks, especially that they're treatment-resistant if somehow the prevailing treatment methods, we hear this a lot in Palestine, don't work. Duran and colleagues indicate that this type of validation can only be done when practitioners themselves become intimately aware of various forms of cultural oppression, to include acquainting oneself with historical and current day immigration trends, consequences, and, quote, political empathy, to have political empathy. That is, empathy that joins with the individual and the group on the basis of social location and oppression. Incorporating such validation practices into our approach to working with folks buffers against potential automatic compliance with existing ideologies. It's our ethical imperative to consistently question where our practice models come from and why they were constructed in the way they were. Duran and colleagues remind us, quote, once historical honesty becomes an integral part of the counseling or healing ceremony session, the fields of counseling and psychology will themselves begin the long-needed healing process that enables counselors and therapists to realize new and untapped aspects of their own psychological liberation. Number three, recognize and acknowledge systems of oppression. Incorporating knowledge of systemic and structural oppression is intimately linked with attuned decolonial care. When we acknowledge class, ethnicity, race, gender, ability, and status as integral parts of the individual and the collective, we're remiss to ignore the structural constructs that culminate in exclusionary practices based on intersectional identities. And in this way, where Crenshaw has talked about this, of course. Recognizing and acknowledging systems of oppression positions us well, for example, to perceive discrimination and offer support to Muslim immigrants, or locate discrimination symptoms as psychological injuries that are situational and outside of the person's control. Name the importance of social location, be attuned to racial melancholia as social phenomena versus dispositional deficit. These are all examples of the things we can do when we actually are alerted to structures of oppression. Acknowledging structural and systemic oppression includes a commitment to challenge their existence and ongoing effects. This is especially important because by design, oppressive systems and structures function to create, sustain, and maintain pathology in service of the social order. That's what you were saying. What we might understand psychologically as perpetual disorder. Right? So these systems create perpetual disorder. Number 4, locate ourselves within systems of oppression. So as clinicians say that we are also part, right? We're also part of these systems. In their study of how social workers might remain ethically driven in their service for immigrant communities in the United States, particularly those in the inhumane detention centers created and sustained by the current administration, Byers and Shapiro posit that, quote, the presence of licensed social workers can serve as a fig leaf, obscuring larger institutional neglect and abuse. This evocative suggestion is also grounding and centering, as it reminds us of a key liberation psychology principle. The imperative for clinicians to examine the ways in which they are complicit in oppressive structures, perhaps unconsciously, by association, or with conscious, well-meaning intentions that drive the majority of mental health care providers. Locating these effects in larger systems of oppression helps de-individualize blame and rather recenters a professional imperative to understand how our practice, our theories, and our profession as a whole is constitutive of larger sociopolitical power structures. This runs directly counter to models that might inadvertently understand the clinical room or profession as existing outside or in opposition to these structures. This is often how it's sold, right? This clinical room is safe, it's outside of here, you can say anything you want in here. This exists outside of the world, as though people don't leave our room, close the door, and go back into their worlds, right? It also helps recenter how we are implicated in the suffering of others. Duren and colleagues further locate us, quote, the various forms of psychological oppression that continue to be perpetuated by many well-meaning and good-hearted counselors, psychologists, and social workers are byproducts of broader economic, political, religious, and social mechanisms that have historically been used to colonize persons from diverse groups and backgrounds. And this is in the context of the United States that they're speaking about. On a practical level, locating ourselves within systems of oppression necessitates a self-examination with particular focus on various privileges that are inextricably linked to our social and cultural positions and identities. Hernandez-Wolff suggests we expand our notion of systems and adopt a global, right, look at things rather than just in the individual or in the specific location we're at. Locating ourselves also includes attending to the ways in which we counter the very systems we come to see ourselves existing within. That is, it does not suffice to merely name the system, but rather, quote, insofar as is feasible, it is critical that counselors take proactive measures so that they are not co-opted by organs of the state that traditionally traumatize our clients. This might be in reference to the NHS, right? This might mean objecting, for example, to work within systems that are fundamentally imbricated in unethical practices, a hint of which we see in a lot of these clinical cases that we worked with in Palestine or spoke of. So refusing, saying, I will not work for the state, or I will not work in these detention centers, or I will not work in black sites. Oftentimes, clinicians are drawn to work within these sites to offer relief and support. However, we may come to consider this work as potentially lending credibility and structural soundness to inhumane and under international law illegal circumstances. This should not be read as a rejection of our objection to these sites, nor should it deter us from demanding ethical and imperative care to these communities. However, it grounds us in the reality that the only viable option for ethical and imperative care is to, in fact, dismantle rather than reform these very structures, right? So our starting point is not saying, I need to be there, like psychologists did in Guantanamo Bay, say, I need to be there to make sure that people aren't doing this. We need to say, by virtue of it being an illegal site, we should not be there to begin with, and we should call for the dismantling of those spaces as our ethical imperative as clinicians, saying, we know what these spaces do to people and to their health and well-being, and they should not be there to begin with. The 4 points I've outlined are an ethical and daily commitment to interrogating our methods, our positions, our moves towards innocence, our continual process, because this is a continual process because the movement toward pathology is seductive, right? What Istvan said was a Palestinian, for example, is either broken by the occupation and needs to be repaired, or is a socially stunted subject, constrained by patriarchy, or just needing psychological guidance to move towards health, right? As though also there's a sort of monolithic idea about what health actually is. This works when we think about it not in these ways, and we don't use these 4 points to sort of center us continuously, works only to reinscribe a particular social and psychological order that actively works against the decolonial and liberatory practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lara. I was actually listening to the tree presentation. I was thinking that we need to relearn how to think. We need to relearn how to dream, how to listen, because it's otherwise no changes is going to happen. So shall we invite the audience to ask questions, share thoughts, anxieties, hope, fear? Yeah.
Thanks to all three of you. I thought they really worked well, actually, side by side, and I kind of started thinking about thinking. But one of the questions I had, I guess, for all three of you, and kind of broader for the kind of conference, is that it seems to me that there's more of a focus now on Fanon's kind of clinical work, and that's kind of happened a lot. Well, it's made me aware. I've become aware of it in British poetry circles because of D.S. Marriott's book With a Fanon, which is kind of a sort of purely psychoanalytic take on Fanon, and probably not without its problems too. But what I wondered is, should we be reading Fanon in the same kind of way that we read Freud and Lacan in critical theory? And if we do that, is that kind of the first gesture to maybe decolonizing critical theory as one of the aspects of the way we think?
I'll speak to psychoanalysis and psychology. I think it's a double-edged sword, because of course I'm going to be the one, my students all read Fanon, right? And I'm going to be the one saying, yes, absolutely needs to be in every institution and every training institution, psychoanalytic institution. The difficulty, though, in which I've seen, and this is what it is about the constant need for us to examine the ways in which we import and deploy Fanon, okay? Because Mireille said yesterday, like, there are ways that clinical psychologists use Fanon, and he would think they're imbeciles for doing so, right? But I think the way that I have seen it in the North American context as well is it's used to defang certain processes and talked about in metaphorical ways, right? So you have largely white audiences invoking Fanon. A mentee of mine actually said this the other day. She was at a training in a psychoanalytic institute in San Francisco, and an all-white panel, and a white man's talking about the black experience as though he's part of that experience, and uses Fanon to explain that. And my mentee, who's multiracial, stands up and says, can we be mindful about the ways in which we import Fanon and the way that we use Fanon? This is just like a very basic ask of clinicians to do. And the speaker said to her, I anticipated that question would come up, but I don't have an answer for you. Okay, so, which says many things, right? Is that you anticipated it and still came with the full arrogance of a white man to not answer that. And you still use Fanon with no sort of humility. And then a man stood up and said, a white clinician stood up and said, I just want to know how we do this. How do we do this, right? So there's always a rush to the action, which is fine, right? I think I told Amin this story before. And my sense of that sort of question is the problematics of introducing Fanon at this level when it's not matched with structural change as well, is that question fundamentally, what do we do? You're telling me about Fanon, okay, but what do we do in the clinical space, is a bad faith question. Because there are indigenous, black, and brown folks that consistently have told you what to do, okay? See black, white, indigenous folks for free in your clinic, and let white folks pay for that, right? Underwrite you. Let the people who have wealth, who have systemic wealth, underwrite that. When you get a keynote and you're white, and especially male in our circles, pass it along to an indigenous, black, or brown person. Those are real things that we can do. So if Fanon is not matched with that, I don't see any structural change happening. I see it, defanged and used in the ways that people want it to, and whiteness recentering itself.
I would just briefly just and simply say that, theory is not essentially regressive or progressive, right? And there's a whole dichotomy of the theory action sort of, world, which obviously most of us don't ascribe to. And I would think, my point is that I think it's good to use Fanon as long as it's not a deflection, as Lara was insinuating. Theory can be a deflection, right? People talk great fucking game, right? But they go out and have fucking $25 fucking scotches after their fucking conferences, right? So the way I think it is when I try to teach or use theory, I always want to weaponize theory. Theory has to be weaponized for the revolution, for liberation. It has to be a destructive and productive force, just like settler colonialism is a productive and destructive force. So,
let me offer a different perspective. I'm not a psychologist, and so I'm an educator for the most part with a background in sociology. To me, it comes down to how we listen to these voices, no? Take Fanon in the context in which he was actually living at that particular point in time. And what is the time that we're living in today? And to me, what actually, when I read Freud, Fanon, and all these people, I want to actually think, what knowledge can I actually produce myself based on the realities that I'm living today? Otherwise, I guess that this is where I'm mostly based on community, to be quite honest. I do a lot of work in universities, but I'm like an insider, no? So, in the sense that I'm just there to help out our young students of color. But in all reality, I think from the standpoint of the community, what knowledge are we going to produce that actually makes sense to what we're experiencing today? To me, that's why I used the quote from Frantz Fanon, right? About changing the world. How are we going to change the world? What are the challenges that we're actually facing? No, so to me, that's again, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I leave it to my colleagues over here. But I think we have to be very critical even of that writing, because it's a frame of reference. To me, it's a frame of reference. It's a revolutionary thinking of that particular time. Now, we can actually move into the future and see that what they experienced hasn't really changed, but we have to come up with our own explanation of what we're actually experiencing today and how we're explaining and defining social phenomena as it interacts with all these systems of oppression. That's the way I look at it.
Any more questions?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering, I can't relate directly to anything that you said, because obviously I'm not in the fields. But more broadly speaking, something that I think all of you could talk to is coming back to Dr. Garcia's idea that to decolonize our minds, we have to come back to where we came from, right? and going back to the idea that we find in lots of post-colonial thought, in particular, like Césaire and Senghor, about the return to something, to refine some particular identities that were lost or repressed. I was thinking also in relation to what Dr. Stephen said, the idea of the affectual power of the idea of Fanon activating the self-realization of a condition of indigeneity, of coloniality, right? I was wondering, on the one hand, we have the idea of return to something, return to a certain kind of selfhood, of subjectivity. On the other hand, there's the difficulties of going back to those forms, those selfhoods, because of course, as far as we try and think about a cyclicality of time, we always have to face the ruptures of violence, of oppression, and I wonder how easy it is to rethink, to return to an idea that is disconnected in some ways from that is not in some ways always related to the violence that's been perpetrated, right? So I'm wondering, how should we do it, and shall we do it in the first place? Also related to what Lara said, does that mean thinking about the colonial selfhood as something broken if we try to do that? Thank you.
So thank you very much for that very complex question. There's a lot there, I think. So I just want to parse out a few things very briefly, try to be brief. Number one is, I think, that for me at least, the idea of return is not one of authenticity. It's not one that was critiqued through post-colonial theorists in the 90s. I think this is why, I was talking to Natasha, I think it was yesterday, it's like why post-colonial theorists are sort of uncomfortable with the issues of decoloniality or decolonial thought, is that it for them evokes this essentialist sort of notion of authenticity, almost like primitivism. One friend of mine called it this, it reeks of primitivism. And I think that's not what return would be. If we can play on that word in terms of Palestine, al-awda, right? For Palestine, return means something. It's the word awda is something very, very important. It means return to Palestine. You were ejected from there by force in 48, and you have lived in exile ever since. Do Palestinians think that they're going to come back and find their homes and just pick up where they started, where they left off? No, that's not how awda is. The awda is, however, a process. I think this is the point, and this is where Jorge is talking about knowledge production, when I was talking about weaponizing theory. It is a process by which we work to produce something that has been disrupted in the past, right? And when I think about history, I think about how there is no history, present, and future in many ways for the colonial subject. It is one moment where when I look at Palestine, I see Palestine. I don't see Israel, I don't see it lost, I don't see it whatever. I see Palestine as a material fact. And the process is in how do we reclaim, remake, and re-seize that. That is the awda, that is the return. And so, and this is what Fanon says. Fanon is very specific about authenticity, right? About nationalist authenticity. But this is, I think, if we look to Fanon, he gives us that guidance in as much as return is actually a return to the future that was stolen and broken in 1492, in 1948. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you, and that was very profound in many different ways. Well, what I like to add is in terms of the self, in terms of where we are, my main issue is that, think about it, we see ourselves and we are defined by the systems of power as subjects of the state. Okay? We are Palestinians, I am Mexican, you might be Brazilian, right? This is how we identified ourselves. Okay? To me, that's the beginning of actually losing our sense of humanness, of being a human. No? In fact, I make the argument that one of the main problems that we have is that today we are, and for the most part, and in most cases, we see ourselves as social beings, a product of our present society. What makes us who we are? What defines us who we are? Our clothes, our car, our titles, our home. That is what actually makes us who we are, right? That doesn't have nothing to do with who we actually are, but this is how we have been moved to see ourselves as, right? And so think about systems of oppression, right? Oppression happens because somebody perceives to have power over somebody else. Does that actually mean that the ones who perceive power actually has a better understanding of him or her? No, it doesn't. In fact, I will make the argument that part of the oppression part is because somebody sees themselves as less than the other person. And so what happens in that transition, in those conversations that are taking place between the oppressed and the oppressor, right, is that we lose that sense of our own selves if we go with that understanding of always fighting the other. And whichever side we might be. And so my thing is that with this idea that we're social beings, it's not to get down on us because we, have this superimposed identity that is created by our society. It's because I make the case that to a great extent, what we have to do in order to understand trauma, in order to understand all these things that we carry within ourselves, is to actually regain our sense of spiritual sovereignty. Take note, spiritual sovereignty doesn't mean religious sovereignty or the believing God or any of those things. It means to have an understanding of who we are, where we stand, where we come from, where we're going, and have a different understanding of ourselves beyond the clothing, beyond the titles, beyond all these things that are superimposed to us. So we can actually break away from this mental oppression and see that we're closer than what we actually think. And the only thing that might just, be different is the language that we speak and the way we see the world because of whatever localities we come from. Outside of that, we're nothing but the same. And so this idea of the other that was superimposed post the 1492, please forget my French and my English, but that's a bunch of bullshit. We're still human beings. And here's something that we think about on the other side of the little charquito, the ocean, right? So there is a saying by the natives in the American continent that we should be thinking about the seventh generation into the future. I'm sorry, you say? Oh. Seventh generation into the future. Again, it's like with the presentation, right? What is that? Right? One might think. Right? How do we actually comprehend that? How do we actually look out for the seventh generation into the future? We have no conception of what that actually means. Right? But it's not that we don't have it. Is that we are not led to think about that because today, by the virtue of our capitalist and very materialistic society, we think about how we're going to benefit about ourselves today, forget about tomorrow, right? Therefore, forget your children and their children and their children's children and forget whoever. Let's make the money now, right? That's the mentality that we have. This is how we think, right? This is the system, the product, the system that we belong to. Right? We have no conception even of thinking how will our children and their children actually going to live their lives. We have no. Why? Because we only see ourselves as being a product of the present society. We are objects of the state. Right? What makes us is a little pinche flag. A flag. I get so mad it's sometimes because think in Mexico, no? In Mexico mainstream society, what do they care about? Beer, football, and the Mexican flag. Most people, right? US, same thing, patriotism. Football, the flag, and be patriotic. Bunch of crap, right? But that's what, so the answer to that to me, again, is a spiritual sovereignty. Regain an understanding of who we are as human beings, right? And so, sorry, that's my answer.
I just want to add something very quickly. Is that I would, as the clinician, I would say a both and in here, is that in some ways, you know, people are always like, don't do black and white thinking, right? Because that's pathological. But I would say under the crush of fascism, that it forfeits its pathology. That making a stance and saying, I'm Palestinian, or I'm Arab, or I'm Lebanese, or whatever it is against the crush of the hegemony of power, that sometimes locating that very stark is really important if you don't also lose the larger connection to the larger process. Right, so that's.
Well, and let me just say, because I don't want to belittle the effect that how we identify ourselves and who we are actually has a meaning. It does have a meaning. It does have a meaning that she's Brazilian, they're Mexican, they're Americans. It does have a meaning, right? But in terms of who we are, right? But we know reality, we have to look beyond that. If we stopped and just looking at understanding ourselves, then that's all we are. No? A piece of meat with a few clothes and the understanding of some patriotic crap, and that's it, right? And so, but I don't want to take, you know, away from the fact that, you know, personal identities. Like me, I'm Mexican, and I'm proud of being Mexican, to be quite honest. No, there is a mural right there in the border with the between the U.S. and Mexico. It has a Christ, and it has a big old sign that says Mexican is God, right? It's funny because Mexican obviously is not God, right? But it's important to understand who we are. Don't get me wrong. But I advocate, let's take it to another level. No, like I said, no, I love to present this idea that we live in a very complex neighborhood called the universe, because that's our neighborhood. If you really think about it, no. So this idea, this far-fetched idea that, you know, aliens or the older civilizations came from the stars. No, we are the stars. Today, we are part of the stars. We are the stars. And I think that if we look at ourselves like that, it gives us a very, in my view, a very elaborate thinking about even the notion of God, the notion of sacredness, right? It takes it to another level. I was talking to my niece, and she says, yeah, God is creation. Yes, God is creation. But we take His creation, and we only live the Word of God, and that's it. Creation is just there to be abused. It's like a prostitute, right? Let's just take advantage, right? Because what really matters is God. And I say, no. Creation is what really matters, because our ancestors tells us that it doesn't really matter, you know, how much we think about God. If the sun doesn't come up for a week, you'll see what happens on the earth. Everybody's going to go ballistic, right? We're all going to die. So that's an absolute. I'm not saying that God is not an absolute, but it's not an answer.
Yes, thank you. I want to go in Lara's direction, though, because even if you talked about, you know, recognizing the universal belonging, or the belonging to the larger universe, there can also be, just like there is an extreme to identity, there can also be an extreme to that. So you have to differentiate, you know, I am a star, well, I am an oppressed star in a given system, right, of oppressors. And then that leads me, then I have to answer a sense of who I am in relation to that system. So then, in order to face the limits of that universal identification, I have to go into an ethnic political identification. So the political identification, not simply ethnic or cultural, socio-political, the colonial identification comes as a remedy to that inflation of the universal. Just like when you get stuck into identity, the universal can become a remedy to that kind of provincialism. So I would not privilege one in that way over the other. The other thing is that when it comes to, in your response, Jorge, to the question about critical theory and Fanon, and you insisted on the importance of the present, right? The present moment. That cannot be more Fanonian. Fanon himself was writing, he was saying, well, I'm writing for my present, for my time. And so the question for why was he saying that in that moment of juncture, transformation of, after the Second World War, the movements of decolonization, that was a very revealing moment for knowing what Western civilization has been like and is like. So on the one hand, is very Fanonian, but then also there is I noticed maybe a tension between your call to be in the present and then your approach to Mesoamerican texts, for example, right? Because it seems that wisdom that you are retrieving from has this kind of permanent universal value, right? And then your call to be in the present, it seems to be reduced because you're giving those texts a particular kind of credence, a particular kind of value that you are a priori denying these other critical texts. So I wonder whether there is a tension there between your appreciation of certain texts of critical theorizing and the value of these other texts and stories. And lastly, I would say that I think that the question of the relevance of any kind of system of thinking has to do with how it allows us to make questions that help us to understand and to deal and act in our world, right, more effectively. And I think part of the power of Fanon's work is that he raised the kind of questions about the system that had been put in place in 1492 and so on and so forth. And even, coming to raise questions that go to the heart of the system, that is very difficult, right? It's very difficult. You can begin to count the thinkers' contributions. And Fanon happened to be one of those because he lived in that particular moment when that system was crumbling and being defied. So I think that because he was living at that moment, he was able, along with other, the folks in that generation, to leave treasures for us, to be thinking a long time. So I think as long as there is the modern colonial Western system, this body of thought will be relevant, right? And it is with that I have in mind to my present, because I still live in that system.
So let me very quick. So a few things. One is that yes, as long as the Western colonial system is in present, we have to think about it. But I also said that we have to learn to think outside of that Western colonial oppressive system, right? Otherwise, we're not going to envision different worlds in which we can actually live if we're always just confronting the Western world. No? That's one thing. The other thing is that, I might give the impression that we have to focus on the present, but actually one of the arguments that I make is that we actually have to learn in the future, right? So the present is for us to understand how we're moving along. No, because in all reality, the present, for the only intended purpose, is more on the philosophical side of things, doesn't really exist, right? The present already passed, right? And so how do we see ourselves into the future? And that's what I see, all these critical thinkers, the value of all these critical thinkers, because to me, the question comes down to not so much how I'm gonna repeat what they said, what are the questions that I'm gonna place myself, the questions that I'm gonna come up, and the questions that I'm gonna exercise in the practice that I'm gonna have. And so to me, that's where the work and the thinking that it was performed during that time is so important, because now this is our time. And how are we moving with our times, following the example of all these thinkers that actually were questioning the systems that they were acting, as you say, they were crumbling in that particular time. And so yes, I said, we have to know where we come from. We have to position ourselves, but it's just so we can move into the future.
Yes, very, very short. First of all, solidarity with sex workers, number one. Number two, what I want to say is that also moving away from not staying within the abstract is moving away to the concrete, in service of the present, like you're saying, Nelson, is that this comes back to the question of what to do. I don't see any other way than land back, right? Give the fucking land back. And that's part of this idea of imagining a new future, right? We find all these other ways to do everything, but somehow that seems impossible. And the start of a new present and a sort of return in any way has to start with the concrete, not just the abstract. Like, we can work on both layers, but land back has to be part of our process. So when we think about decoloniality, it's not just in metaphor, not just in thought, not just in abstract, and that is part of the clinical aspect as well, right? In in our context of Palestine, is that it must start with a reseizing. It's a land back process. Start there, move forward, not with dialogue. We don't start with dialogue groups and move backwards, which is what clinical psychology often says to do.
Let me thank you very much. I'm very sorry. I have to apologize. I beg for your forgiveness. Unfortunately, we're running a bit late, and I can only humbly ask for your forgiveness. I'm sure that there are more questions. The day hasn't ended. We're still dealing with time as best as we can. So we will have a chance to address more questions, of course. Please save your question. Please save it. Thank you very much, and thanks for understanding. Can I invite Dr. Louis Gordon and the members of Decolonize This Place, who will take part in the very next panel, to take to the stage.